nice faces of multiple people that have been here every single time. Yes, I'm talking about you, and you, and you. Yes, I see you guys, and like, I just cannot thank you enough for coming along this journey with me. And you know, we're playing earlier tonight, which, I don't know, as I mature, I won't say age, as I mature, the earlier shows are like, oh sweet, I can be in my pajamas by 10. I love this. It used to feel like, no, only when it's dark. But I will say this is so cool because we always come out here after the sun is set and I can see glimpses of you guys shimmering in the spotlights that hit the audience. But this is the first time I've walked onto the stage and actually gotten to see all of you. This is amazing. You're a beautiful sight. You know, this next song that we're going to play for you is actually the second piece I ever wrote. I'm taking it way back. And you know, when I first started writing music, I just was like, I want it to be as fast and complicated as possible. That was like what I thought would be really cool to the world. I definitely learned that the world actually doesn't care how complicated it is for a violinist to play something. But that was at the beginning. I just was like, I'm gonna put as many arpeggios in the chorus as possible. And so there's a reason that I haven't played this song live in years. It's because back when I wrote it, I never thought about the fact that, I don't know, I might get to play it live. I wrote this song when no one knew who I was, and so the fact that now I get to play it live with a symphony after years and years of not doing it, and I have to say, this one actually goes out to my mom. This is her favorite song, and almost every tour she goes, are you gonna play Transcendence? And I was like, oh, dang it, it didn't make the set list. Oh shoot, so my mother is here tonight. I love you, Mom. This one's for you. sacrificed a lot so I could be here tonight, from the time I was a child. I can still remember as a little kid practicing and from the kitchen hearing, a little flat. She was always paying attention, she was always there, she was always taking whatever sacrifice, like, you know, I didn't think about it as a kid, but she like never had a new dress, but yet she could always afford my violin lessons. And she could always afford the extra orchestra fees for the extracurricular orchestra. And so I just want to say, please give a huge round of applause for my mom. She usually flies out about a week before any of my tours and she helps me rhinestone costumes. Partially because, you know, I could hire someone else to do it, but I actually just really enjoy spending time with her and doing it's become a tradition. Okay, I'll stop embarrassing you. You know, this next song was the first time I really tried to tell a story through music. It's what I always wanted to do. I've always loved storytelling. And when I wrote this next song, I went in with the producer and I told him a very specific story and what the music video was going to look like. And I said, it's about a ballerina who's trapped inside a music box. And for me, the story was a metaphor for a time when I felt so trapped inside of an eating disorder. And for a long time, I felt like it was protecting me. And so the same way this beautiful ballerina in this snow globe, she thinks that this glass case is actually a protection, but as she starts to realize, as she listens to the music and the repetitive sounds and the fact that she can't change, she realizes that it's actually a cage. And so this is about the ballerina waking up and being brave enough to break outside of the music box.
Beats
got it on their set list bingo card. It's really, this is a surprise. And you know, growing up, my parents loved playing classical music in our home, and it's what made me fall in love with the violin. I remember being taken to an orchestra concert, and that is what made me say, I want to play that. It was seeing the orchestra play and the violinists being the show-offs that they are with all the fast parts. I was sold, I knew my destiny. But this next piece we're gonna play actually goes out to my dad. He passed away several years ago, and this was his favorite orchestra piece. And my dad was a great storyteller. It was him that made me fall in love with the idea of telling stories, because he had the best voice and he knew when to make all the dramatic pauses, and he knew all the just amount of detail to give. And he told me the story behind this song, that it's about skeletons. It's kind of that, the dance about the skeletons leading the newly dead down to the underworld. And so throughout you'll hear the bones clanking. And it was these moments that really, I think, subconsciously turned me into a person that wanted to share stories through instruments. And so I hope you guys enjoy this. I'm actually gonna go join the orchestra. We're gonna play Dance of the Macabre. for letting me join you in that moment. Also give it up for Yumi, our soloist, one more time. And Jason, our conductor. I'm actually pretty proud of myself. I killed that. I was so nervous for that part of the show. And I thought, well, no one's gonna be watching me. And then I sat down. I was like, yes, they will. You're in a giant red dress. But I now don't have to make my stand partner sign an NDA. I did okay. I will say, when we were rehearsing it yesterday, one of the violinists that was sitting next to me after we did the first run through, and I was like so sweaty, he turned and he said, you know, you're gonna have to work a little harder if you wanna make the payroll. Which I appreciate. Good joke. That made me giggle. And then I tried harder. Okay. All right. This next song is called Evil Twin. for me. It's like I'm getting to go back to my roots, the things, like I said, that made me fall in love with the violin, the type of groups, well, actually, I never made it this elite, but playing in orchestras is what really honed my craft and, taught me the ropes of being a violinist. And I will say, though, there are some terrifying words in classical music, like in the rehearsal, Jason kept saying, and this one, Lindsey will start us with a cadenza. And I was like, what? No, I'm not playing a cadenza. And then I realized he was referring to what I usually call the intro. Much less aggressive. I was like, oh yes, the cadenza. So that was just a cadenza I played for you. And this next song actually starts with an extended intro as well. But this next song, this is a cover, and before I ever wrote a song, when I was in that stage of like, I don't know how to write music, how would one even consider starting that process? The first thing that kind of got me warmed up to it was when I was in high school, I loved to arrange things. I loved to make my own renditions of songs, whether it was like a hymn to play in church, I would always make my own version of it. And this next song that we're gonna play for you is an arrangement I actually wrote in high school. And it wasn't until like years later when I was a professional violinist that I thought to myself, that was actually pretty good. I should revisit that. And sure enough, it was pretty good, what I could piece together from my memory. And, when I was playing it in high school, though, it was just me with these imaginary friends playing with me. And we then turned it into a rock song, and that was a lot of fun. But tonight I get to play it as I always imagined it, as teenage Lindsey just rocking out in my house. So this is my version of Phantom of the Opera. had this time when I was doing gigs all by myself. I was flying around, and literally this is what my show looked like. I had a little pedal board, and it had some effects on it, and then I would bring a stool and set my iPod. Kids, that's how we used to play music. I set my iPod on it, and I had all my little songs, and I would like have one hand touching it and be like, this next song is called Crystallize. And then I'd press the buttons. Anyways, it was pretty tacky, and I was traveling all by myself all the time, and I just remember thinking, I don't know how much longer I can do this. This is really hard, it's really lonely. Most of the time I'm playing in cafeterias where no one actually cares. But I really am a firm believer that sometimes you have to go a few steps past the point where you say, I can't do this anymore. Because I definitely kept going for probably about 6 months after I literally was like, I can't do this anymore. And then, lo and behold, I wrote Crystallize. And I never would have thought that would be the one. I actually was really afraid no one would like it, but I was like, well, I spent a lot of money on this song, because at the time I had to pay a producer for all the tracks before I even wrote them, and so I was like, well, I better release it, because I wrote it. I paid for it. And anyways, I remember within a day, within less than 24 hours, it got 1 million views on YouTube. And I kept refreshing the page, because I thought I was mistaken, and I even called my sister, and I was like, can you go to my video and tell me how many views you see? And yes, that was the moment that I thought, I think my life just changed, and it had. But I want to, on this next song, I want to have you guys kind of think of your manifestations, your dreams. I really do believe in manifesting. I believe that the energy we put out into the world, I believe it comes back to us. I think that when we visualize the things we want, not only are we kind of, there's the woo-woo that we're magically drawing them to us, but also when you focus on something, you magically move towards it. It's just the way it is. Like the gentleman wearing the bright neon orange. If I was going to walk to anybody in the audience, it would be you. Make your dreams the neon orange gentleman. Focus on them, see them, put them in your periphery, don't look away. And so as I play this next song, I actually wrote it to be a meditation song or a breathwork or a manifestation song. So I'm going to invite you as we play this to close your eyes. And I want you to you can put your hands on your heart, you can leave them open on your knees, but I want you to think of one of your dreams. Or if you don't want to focus on yourself, think of somebody else that you want to send good energy to for their dreams. This is your moment to just close your eyes and feel. If nothing else, just feel the music. Don't look at me. wrote this song. It's about the moon, basically. I wrote it about how the moon goes in phases, and I think it's actually quite fascinating, and it's really kind of helped me as I've developed this analogy with mental health that connects to the moon, because the moon does go in phases, and sometimes it's bright and it's full and it's so bright that it can almost light up the night sky, and other times it's completely gone. And if we didn't know better, you'd think maybe it left and decided not to look after us anymore. But we all know that the moon will come back. And you know, after I experienced loss for the first time, you know, my father passed away, my best friend passed away, and I remember thinking for a really long time that loss apparently just changes you. And that like rose-tinted glasses version of myself, I was like, I guess she's gone, because we're talking about 2 years of a pretty severe grieving and depression. And I remember right about the time that I was writing the Artemis album, which was all based on the moon, it turns out, because of this, I felt my light click on again. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's not that I was gone, it's just that I was covered in shadow. And so now whenever I'm going through a hard time, I remind myself that like, hey, tomorrow might be different. Maybe the shadow will go away. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's a month, who knows? But I know, because time has taught me, that I will always come back to my full light, the same way the moon does every single time. And so I wrote this song about the moon and how it looks after us, but really it's about my angels and my belief that I really feel like they're with us all the time. So this is Between Twilight. Dance in the Forest with Derek Huff. The ladies know what I'm talking about. Derek Huff, yeah. So some would say I actually wrote that song for that purpose, which was a nice byproduct. But you know, I love going in and writing songs about a theme. You know, I love visuals. I love being inspired by stories. And this next song was actually just inspired by one word. When I went in to write it, I was like, I just want to capture that feeling of the first bud of hope. You know, when you feel like you've been walking through a dark tunnel and you actually don't know if there's an exit. And then all of a sudden you see this little glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. That's what I want to write. I want to write that feeling. And so this is Take Flight. deep cut, another throwback. But I will say, when we did meet and greet today, this is the one that everyone was like, we overheard you practicing and we can't believe you're playing this one. I was like, okay, this is the one. Let's go.
Crystallize, you found me through one of those, for sure. So thank you to all my gamers. You guys have just been with me thick and thin. Thank you. Actually, I just thought of a funny story. I remember on our first tour, no girls. It was all gamer dudes. Gavi, he was like, you know, Linz, do you think you could work on getting some female fans? Like, he dreamed of being a rock star his whole life, and then he was playing to a bunch of gamers, dudes. He's like, where's all the girls? Anyways, so here are my ladies in the house. They want to talk to you. I got so excited when the scale finally hit 50-50. I was like, my ladies are here. I mean, I love you guys. I love my boys. I'm a girl's girl. I grew up with sisters. I've always been a girl's girl, so. You know, part of what made this so exciting to do a show with the symphony was the fact that I got to revisit some of my old songs that I haven't musically visited, some of them since I wrote them. You know, we've played them, we have, you know, mashed them together, but I haven't been like, oh, let's arrange these. Let's go back into the guts of it and see what we can make. And so to have like a whole new set of paintbrushes to work with and a whole new palette of colors, it was just so much fun. And this next one, I was very specific that I was like, I want the woodwinds and the strings on my team, and I want the brass on Ryan's team.
Oh, that's gonna be amazing.
so much. Okay, I'm feeling the elevation. I was like, oh, it's not that bad today. It's because you're in a pretty dress and high heels, that's why. By the way,
I should mention that thank heavens there was an intermission. It took me the entire intermission to change. These lace-up backs, they're no joke. I couldn't get out of the first one, and then I couldn't get into the second one. They were literally like, Lindsey, you have 3 minutes? So anyways, thanks for a long intermission, we love it. Okay, so that song goes back to my love of fiddle music, as well as this next one, because when I was a kid, that was like my reward for practicing my classical music. It's like, okay, if you practice your pieces, then you can play whatever you want. And for me, it was always fiddle music. It didn't matter if it was bluegrass or Western, or in the case of this next song, Celtic. A night with the Symphony, and it felt kind of like story time. I really loved that. So thank you for joining us tonight, you guys. We have one last song for you. And, you know, a lot of these songs, I feel like they're taking me back to my roots a little bit. This song kind of came from a moment in my career when I was just very embarrassed and didn't know if I could continue. And I just thought, you know what, maybe everybody's right. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe there is no place for me in this world of performers. And I think your mind sometimes is so strong and so powerful, and it will try to protect you. Like Lindsey, we do not want to get on a stage again after that humiliating run of experiences. You know, and it's looking out for us. However, I believe that so much stronger, or I guess so much more in tune than our mind, and that voice is the voice in our hearts. And even if it's a little bit quieter,
if we actually pay attention, once the mind calms down, the heart will tell you a truer compass. And I remember at this time, even though I wanted to quit and I just didn't want to continue anymore, I could not stop listening to my heart that kept saying, there is more for you. Do not quit. Get up. Try again. And I truly, truly think that if we all had a chance to see our full potential of what we could become, we would be absolutely astounded at ourselves. And so when you hit that moment of wanting to give up, listen to the truer compass, listen to your heart, let that be the one that tells you what your next move should be. Because it, I truly believe, is connected to something so much greater, and that's what truly knows your potential. So this is I of the Untold Her.